Hello, Guy.
Hello, sir.
Welcome back.
Thank you.
You are the first person to make a second visit to Sense Space now. So
I'm the first second. I'm looking for a joke about that, but for once one isn't coming.
we'll let it marinate. We'll let it marinate.
Yeah.
um,
It's good to be on. I like what you're doing.
yeah. Well, how did you find the Zach Stein conversation?
That was great. It was really great. Well, he's just such an interesting guy.
Mm.
Like he's just an interesting guy, and he's operating at a level of things the stuff that he said about paradigms, right? And the difference between being of a paradigm and letting it be object allows you to then speak, as I would say, like speak the language of your cult in the language of another cult in a second as a practice, right? In some sense, which was a relief to hear with understanding his affinity with integral, because that's one of the I've always had a little bit of a hard time with I don't know if it's integral per se, but integral folks, more the culture around integral, right? I always had this sense in which they were using terms, right, without what it takes to have those terms, right? Like, so it was as if they were deeply thinking about things profoundly, but there was a sense in which they just kind of picked it up and started labeling things in terms of this. And I just always found it a bit empty for me. So like hearing him talk about it, I got much more of a sense of like, no, integral is a way of thinking, right? Isn't necessarily a product of the thought, but a way of thinking.
A spirit.
Like he was really, applying it in a certain sense. I really like that.
Yeah, I had the same experience. The whole like the red and the green and all of the different terms that they have. And but I did end up reading Ken Wilber's book, Brief History of Everything, I think is like one of the first ones. And it's written as a dialogue. It's pretty good. But for me, it's really, I just extracted the spirit of integral, which is sort of transcend and include effectively. And that every stage of development has some fruits in it and has some issues in it. Which is the big conceit of the modernity and the time that we're living in, is that we just brush away, or we pick and choose. So yeah, it was a good conversation, and he's very high level, and I'm sure there'll be some continuity with what we talk about today, and probably some continuity with the conversation with John as well.
John seemed to be in that conversation. He seemed to really key in on your sensibility around Christianity. Like I think he really connected with you there.
Yeah, it definitely felt like something slotted into place. Us having a commonality of background, and me kind of having been on a long track with it and taking quite a playful approach to it. Having been through, having journeyed in the world of psychedelics, you can begin to read religious texts and mystical texts through the lens of those experiences, and you can kind of, the whole like Daniel Schmachtenberger, like listen for the signal and the noise. Took a long time to get to a point where I was open enough to attempt that.
Yeah.
But I have sort of begun to attempt that in kind. And I listen for the signal. And so when I read about strange occurrences and, tongues of fire and all of this stuff, I try and think like, well, what could that have actually been in relationship to the weirdest experiences I've had?
Yeah.
And yeah.
It takes something to do that, doesn't it? Like, you had to, what I'm hearing you say is you had to come through to being able to do that. Because there's something about Christianity that I don't know what it is. There's something so familiar in some of the terms that like come with all this baggage, right? That on some level most modernity has been pushing against for a long time. So it's like it takes something to push past that thing into the actual intelligibility that I think originally that all that came from.
Yeah.
That's not easy.
Yeah. And off the back of that conversation, I had a couple of different people reach out and had some non-recorded conversations as well with one guy who's actually a Jehovah's Witness and another guy who seems to have had a very similar track to me. Yeah, very fruitful. A lot of interesting stuff about kind of discontinuities between what's being said and what's being embodied. That seemed to be a very emergent theme of it, was experiences of communities and so forth where there was a doctrinal set of values and then there was what was actually embodied. It's like you can train yourself, or you can be enculturated in a context of care or of love or of intimacy, which is not actually afforded by your capacity or the context. My dad was telling me, a lot of these prayer groups, they just kind of stick a bunch of people together and get them talking in this really intimate way without actually having that natural friendship, which would be the basis of it. So there's kind of a difference between an organically developing thing and then the institution of church. And then there's a lot of feeling that there's a certain brokenness which is a part of the togetherness of it, and that the institution itself is somehow sustained by you not fully developing beyond it.
Yeah, totally. I wonder if this has something to do with, I heard Johannes's teacher, his professor at college, talk about this, and I've also been reading his book, The Principles of Philosophy, which sounds like such a generic, ordinary title, read book, right? It's just like, looks like, I don't know, maybe a boring textbook of some kind.
No.
But man, talk about the reading of which you end up reading that one of those experiences where you're reading, as you're reading, you're hearing about the frame of reference that is reading that you didn't know was the frame, right? It's like one of those hermeneutic experiences of like he just abstracted out the underlying intelligibility upon which my thinking was thinking that thought, which when you do that, something ecstatic kind of happens. The whole book is like that. It's amazing when you take that stuff really seriously, like language and intelligibility. But one of the things he was talking about in one of the videos with Johannes, I think it was on the end of philosophy. I think it was that one. where it was this, you know, you could say before the pre-Socratics, right? Language and thinking was more, our relationship to it was one in which was in the mythopoetic sense, like that language gave us shelter, right, inside of being, right? So the Homer and mythology and those kinds of things is where the language was one in which you found you found shelter in the world, and it held you, right, in these images. And then around with the pre-Socratics, all of a sudden, see if I can get this correct. Man started to think being as a whole, right? And everything that we stand on is predicated on that, right? As Heidegger would say, the being of beings. And once we could start to think and abstract out the sense in which what all beings partake, a certain different relationship to being started to come into existence, right, to the world. Because now we could have a relationship with being, right, through our cognition, through our thinking. And if you think about what we're in relationship with through thinking, the being is like the category of categories, right? It's the thing upon which every thing that you can name, right, its intelligibility is based on that. So all of a sudden, man now has access to understand something, the understanding of which can literally have the world show up based on an understanding. That's basically philosophy. And then it was about, right, where in some sense, the standing, right, or the holding that found shelter, now in a certain sense, man started to do this thing where he could hold, kind of, you could say, hold himself in standing relationship with being, right? And rather than the being finding itself immersed in a kind of a mythical world, all of a sudden we took that sheltering or that gathering holding, and could hold ourselves, right, and have an inquiry into that relationship. And then what's interesting is, like, and that's all the stuff around, right, the understanding of being thought as phusis, right, the thatness, the sense in which being could you could say disclose in a spontaneous disclosedness that wasn't given through apprehension of our senses, but we could start to see a logos behind it. And so that which you didn't see, you could actually start to grab hold of and realize was a deeper pattern embodied through all of the things that you saw. And then in Plato, as it moved on, it became more of, I think, idios, one of those Greek terms, but it was more about the sense of the whatness of being. What is being, right? That's when you start to get into talk of the good, right, and all that stuff with Plato. But then, and this is kind of tying it back to Christianity, what's really interesting when you think about this, then Christianity started to come online, and the revealed truth, right, the more of the mythical poetic sense of it, right, then being became the supreme being, and then thinking after that, and and theology was born, where philosophy now became not something that was grappling with what or how, right, or that there was being. Instead, being was seen as God, the supreme being, and then all thinking was to derive its truth to reveal it, right? So in some sense, like thinking no longer went to and grappled with the sense of being. And that's the whole thing about theology, right? And it's like the wedding of these two sensibilities. And so it's kind of interesting to think about it like that. And you get that because I've been thinking quite a bit about this. There is something relieving to imagine what a medieval town was, right? Like the idea of the medieval time is like the highest point in the town is the church. So you're constantly reminded of what, right, who's in charge or the most infinite point of reference. And then everything points back to that, almost like a mandala, right? Everything everyone does, right, is in relationship to that, and is the customs, the manners, the buildings, the architecture, everything is disclosing this intelligibility. Doesn't that sound nice?
Well, it's certainly one of the sort of experiments that I ran recently with a friend was to go for a leisurely walk in London, and we went to Southwark Cathedral. And in the cathedral, we kind of stepped into this sort of side room, like a prayer room or whatever. My friend is Pakistani, but went to a Christian, like a English Catholic, like one of those old schools that had like a 14th century chapel on the grounds and stuff. So he had a relationship to it as well. And we started kind of talking about religion, and the death of God and all of this stuff. And then as we were walking around, I began to look at the stained glass mirrors and try to put myself really fully into the mindset of especially of the medieval peasant, for whom that was the highest quality of special effects / psychedelic experience known. And there's a weird kind of illumined quality to these symbolic representations, which has like a timelessness to it as well.
Right. It really gathers, doesn't it? When you really get present to that artwork or to the stained glass or the symbol. I mean, everything about it is just so, if you really like meditate on it or you really give yourself to it, man, it is, there's something deeply organizing to it. But in this strange way where on some level, it's also got an explanation because it's also backed by all this thinking, which is what theologians just did, right? It wasn't thinking, it was a different kind of thinking. It was that there was the revealed truth of God, right? And you couldn't not think that, right? That was just kind of the point. And then so truth was about showing how rationally that was true. So everything, its measure was measured by this kind of literally monotheistic center.
Yeah, I've been getting into a lot about the sort of oneness and two-ness of reality, and I don't know if I can even better articulate it than that, but kind of trying to hold that aspect of monotheism, of the unity of everything, and then the two-ness, right, the multiplicity of things as well. And this has really been fed by my kind of inquiries into nature, both of the natural world and the human, the human body as well. There's all of these different things when you're looking at a tree and you're contemplating a tree. There's a way in which you can perceive it as like this one sort of solid thing. You have this and you have emerging out, and then you have the roots going down, but those roots split down so much into such minute sort of tendril-like interaction with the soil that at some point they're really not really distinguished.
Yeah.
And so too with the leaves coming from the branches down onto the ground. This is something that's revealed a lot more in an urban environment because there's nowhere really for the leaves to go. So you see like a violet covered tree, and then you see this surround on the ground. On some like non-dual level, this part and this part are not separate things.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So I'm bringing in a lot of different pieces into this conversation, and we are like in so many different territories, and I'm wondering how to gather them together. And probably the best way for me to do that is to just presence them, and see what you make of it, really. Because we were talking a little bit before. I mentioned this with John actually, about the kind of set and setting psychedelic nature of reality during COVID, a number of people, Jordan Hall and Yuvi Ivanova and other people, were saying the veil is thinner now, which is very curious to me. What is the veil? I think the veil is something like consensus reality, and the revealing of that is what I talked about with John, with this kind of cyclist emerging into my field of vision. And for a moment, it's just like this amorphous thing, and then it actually manifests as what it is. And since then, I've had a number of similar experiences with dropping in on conversation as well. Like I was in Greece on the metro, and I had some ambient conversation, and my brain interpreted it as like some English women speaking, and it was just absolutely not the case. But I realized something about my disposition and associations interpreted what I couldn't quite make out. And so we have that occurring. We have this kind of revealing going on in the day-to-day as we're walking around. And then we have Jung and his argumentation about dreams, which I've been reading, which, by the way, is interesting in itself, because I had read Man and His Symbols a number of years ago and found it to be, I had kind of read it in my academic harvesting kind of mode of reading. And so I got almost nothing from it, because I was just like, blitz and extract kind of relationship to text. But since reading Heidegger,
we got to talk about what that was like.
I'm very near to the end of Being in Time, which you kindly or not so kindly sort of recommended for me. That has completely retrained my relationship to reading, because it's so bloody difficult in large part. You have to read it very closely and very slowly, and you really are deducing what is being expressed. And so when I read Jung the second time, I read it in the fashion informed by this. and the text revealed itself in a very different way.
Yeah.
It was as if Jung was writing something in the words and the content, and then there was something else going on. And as he was talking about the unconscious and the unconscious associations and the relationship of the conscious mind to dreaming and the unconscious, I felt my present reality become stranger and more curious.
Right. I like how stranger means good to you. More of that, i.e. go towards that stranger. Yes. Pause 1 second. There's a saw that's going on in the. There you go.
Yeah.
I think what you just said, I had just sparkled for me. So I just want to see what that was. When you talked about reading being in time, that it required a reading that was really like, I think he said he reintroduced you to a different way of reading, because every part of it, right, one is just really rigorous and difficult, right? However, something almost beyond what just the text said, right, had something shine through it. It's difficult to put into words, and it's difficult to reduce down to just what was said in the text in such a way that when you read another author in the same way of reading, which is interesting. I want to get at what that way is. What you said is Jung disclosed something different than the first time you read Jung. That disclosure, right, I think is, if you think about it, what is our access to the world? It discloses itself, right? I think the thing that's interesting to me is that there's a way that reading, and this has really been my experience too, of there's something going on with reading in the way that you read that seems to touch on something that is, I think, symbolically and literally our relationship with the world. That there's a way I can participate with the world that comes through, its disclosure comes through the way I participate with it, such that I can, the way that I relate to Jung 10 years ago versus the way I relate to Jung today is what it reveals the world really, really differently. If you ask me, this is what's worth thinking about. This is what's worth doing as human beings, and this is what human beings are, right? We're world disclosures. And I think that the veil, perhaps the veil that Jordan is talking about, that's thinner, is that the world can't make sense anymore. Like, in other words, the information on the text isn't going to have the world make sense to you anymore, right? Your way of reading, you can't just read it like you used to be able to read it for information and take it as given and, right, nominalize it and then live your life being substantiated within those nominalizations and just, idling along. That there's enough stuff going on, right, that doesn't make sense, that requires, I think it reveals the deep way in which our reading participates in what's being disclosed in the text.
Yeah, there's a real sort of intersubjective reality being revealed in this experience, which necessitates us letting go of the notion that we're all reading the same book. because on some level we're not.
Yeah.
It's informed by our experiences, but it's more deeply informed by our relationship to the world. And so this way of reading is also something which is transpiring outside. It's transpiring in the way that I'm walking around in Berlin. Well, it's quite exhausting, actually, because I used to be able to blitz through enormous amounts of text because I was goal-oriented, and I trained in a certain way for my university studies, which was a kind of extraction methodology to boil down and extract what was useful. But that presupposes that I know what's useful, or I know what I'm looking for. And when you come up against these texts, these deep philosophers, very quickly you no longer know what it was you were looking for, and something else is shining through, but it's kind of necessitating you to like move with it in a different way. And then when you're going out into the world, you're experiencing the world in a different way as well.
And what I heard you say with Heidegger is that you emphasize the difficulty of it. So there's some relationship with suffering. You have to suffer it, right?
Yes, and that was not something that I was on board for before.
Right.
But for whatever reason, some crazy reason, it's like, guys really into Heidegger, I gotta check this out. And I started reading it. I was like, well, I trust you, and so I trust that there's a there. And so I began struggling through, and I've been with this book now for many, many months, and I can't just go and finish it like I can with another book, because, and I can't go into it with a goal orientation of like, I'm going to get through the chapter or through to the end, because getting through one page or 3 pages of this book is really energy intensive.
Yeah, totally. And if you feel into what is it, so on some level, if we look at back at this, so you read something in me. I'm just wondering if, like, in a certain sense, what, like, I is a symbol, right, to you, right? You entrusted that gave, you went, oh, there must be something here because he's really into that. Even though I look at that stuff and I'm like, what the hell is that? It's like, but like, if he's seeing something, and I would imagine on some level, like, the thing that you see going on in me is that there's a way that there's a world disclosure that happens, right? And so I would imagine on some level it was, and I really relate to that. Like so many books that I've ended up reading is not because I looked at those things and thought to myself, oh, that looks like a good thing. It's no, like, some mentor of mine was really into it, or they said this. And usually what I was trusting them, but what does them mean? Right. I think in these cases, it really did have to do with, now that I'm thinking about it, there's a way that the world shows up for them and discloses for them, that when I participate in that world, I am somehow more than I would be if I wasn't.
And well, so this is interesting too, is that when I first saw you on Rebel Wisdom, like a couple of years back, probably, I saw a guy and I was like, didn't make anything of you. It didn't strike me. Nothing happened. But then later on, as you started popping up more and doing interviews with other people, it was almost as if you were revealed in relationship to them. which is totally analogous to what was going on with Jung.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And my relationship with reading has changed, but also my relationship with the selection of what I read has also changed in a similar way to what you suggested. It feels more that I'm on an intuitive breadcrumb trail, and I'm listening to the world for where to go next. And then I follow that intuition, and the book comes and I start reading it, and then there's something in there which really comes with me, and that intuition is kind of confirmed in a way.
You said something just then. I listen to the world. What do you mean by listening?
I think it's more of a sitting back and allowing for the arising of, rather than an active, like a verb, like an active doing or catching or seeking.
Mm-hmm.
It's more like allowing the thing to arrive to you.
Yeah, totally. And how would you say, is it listening that has, I'll ask it like this, how do you know what is worthy of listening to? So like on some level, listening is basically allowing, like letting the world disclose itself to you, right? Is it listening that hears what to hear? Like I think this is what we're kind of getting at, is like, oh, how do I?
That's what you're touching on now. Kind of is something ontological, some sort of horizon, which brings into question free will, and touches on this sense that my decision making, and more specifically my listening, and what arises as salient to me, is informed by such a web of associations, is informed by a kind of story, or a collection of narrative arcs we could perhaps delineate in my life up to the point of those things happening, which drew that out. You know, when I first was drawn to start looking and understanding Islam, that of course made very little sense based on my life and background up to that point. And yet there was something captivating, which was drawing me into it, and I was coming to understand something.
Something was so alive about when you talked about captivating, that whatever that is, whatever that sense is, I think I owe everything I call good in my life is a function of that, right? Everything I really value and has this quality of, I'm going along and then something calls to me. Like, in fact, the more it doesn't make sense, the more, in fact, it calls beyond my sense making, if you will. In fact, it's precisely what gathers my attention, and it is a captivation, right? There's something. This is like a big mystery to me, on how do I know when something captures and glows to me, sparkles to me, and I start to engage with it. I start to be captivated. I start to find myself given over to it. 20 years later, I look back and realize, right, a whole style of life that was articulated through the process of this becoming disclosed. But how did I know if I didn't understand it? beforehand? How did I know to be interested in it? This is like one of the mysteries to me.
And well, I've definitely been on a process of leaning into that, which means having like more relationship to not knowing and less relationship to knowing at the level of who I am, where I'm going, which previously for me, like someone would ask me how I'm doing and I would tell them what I'm doing. And, I'd be like, well, I'm doing this in order to do this and so forth and so forth. And this was the kind of relationship to self and to world and to future. So you have to loosen up, first of all, in order for this to transpire. And there's a lot of ways to do it. One of them is you're curious and you seek out experiences which take you to the edge of your intelligibility. And those are very revealing. Another is that life comes and meets you in some devastating way. Tragedy knocks at your door. Your will, well, at least in my case, my will was exhausted in relationship to the world. It was as if the world provided me with the circumstance in which I could drive and drive and drive and drive with my willpower until it was completely undone by circumstance. And then you're left in an interesting position after that. When you're in the tragic state, you develop more of a relationship to not knowing as well. Not in the least because you don't know when you're gonna be able to move out of that state, but also because the characteristic of that state is a contraction of all those future plans and everything that your identity rested upon. So it really brings everything in a way that reduces how much reality is disclosed to you and reduces what's interesting, and makes everything really bloody difficult. But so those are some of the pieces. But one that's quite particularly strange is how far do we take this listening to world? There's that we can take it into, well, maybe my relationship to thinkers or authors or books. Instead of like reading a list of what other people say you should read, you're listening for it, and then kind of like, oh, that seems like it might be an interesting piece of the puzzle, and then you go towards that. But then you can also begin to have this just in the world. I've had experiences where I'm looking at things written on people's t-shirts and, little signs. And this is something that I also hold very lightly. And it's something that comes out of the psychedelic experience almost certainly, is that you start to see things which have a certain sign-like quality to them, and you're just like, oh, that's interesting. You entertain it, but you don't. The key is that when strange things occur, you don't just sort of reactively shut that out in order to maintain the coherence of the view that you have. You just allow it to be there, and that begins to imbue your whole relationship to the world. And then you can be following that intuitive impulse, and which is what I've been doing, I feel like, with this whole last 6 months, more and more. And now it's beginning to produce beautiful fruit. So it seems to confirm itself. One teacher of mine, someone that you know, said to me when we were speaking, like a homeless guy came up to us and started sort of blabbing about some random stuff. He clearly looked like he was washed out. But the teacher that I was with looked at him, fully listened to what he said, responded to him, and then came back to me and said, like, I wouldn't have been surprised if he told me exactly what I needed to hear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that seems to me to come from a place of, you're not just relating to individuals and objects, so to speak. You're relating to world, and world is in a kind of communication with you, not in a very clear way and not in a concrete way, more in the way that that comes about from developing a relationship to your dreams, and that kind of thing. Getting that dream interpretation in can begin to loosen up your relationship to conscious reality, and then begin to look for, well, one of the things that Jung talks about in Man and His Symbols is that day-to-day objects and little things can take on really uncanny importance and be imbued with deep, deep meaning. And as you spoke on your video about Heraclitus, was it Heraclitus? Yeah. The sense in which when you lean into the logos, or you're listening for the logos, reality itself can start to seem to emanate. Objects and things seem to hint to you that there's something a little more to them than what they actually show up to be. The edges are kind of illumined. And what I have been coming to understand is that the greater you're leaning into that frontier, the greater you're experiencing objects more and more, to the extent that you could be, sort of contemplating the deepest meanings of your life whilst looking at a flower or a glass of water or something. This is actually like a going out deeper into the world and deeper into self at the same time, and the two are becoming less and less distinguished. And then this is where the whole veil thing, this is how we can begin to understand the veil notion and the way in which reality itself is always psychedelic, in the sense of psychedelia, mind manifesting. We experience reality as a manifestation of mind. How we interpret mind is another matter, but this is most apparent and simple. Simply put, if you're very, very hungry and you haven't had your dinner and you're walking around, reality seems to become very, very much reduced. The color is drawn out, and your capacity to relate to everything is drawn out.
And then what speaks to you is smells of food, and right, everything becomes in terms of your hunger. Yeah.
And if you have a trauma in your past associated with a certain thing, then that becomes more salient in reality to you. But it doesn't just become more salient. The fact that, supposing that I was subject to some act of cruelty by a sports coach, It's not just that I'm now more, okay. It's not just that you're more anxious towards people who trigger this memory. It's that this memory somehow draws out that aspect in reality towards you as well. This is what I was really uncovering with the landscape of trauma, was that our traumas really shape our reality and the way that we experience it, and draw things out of reality toward us. Like the world comes to meet us in relationship to our trauma, insofar as we have not fully understood it and worked through it.
Yeah, especially, wouldn't you say, with trauma, especially in the forehaving, right? Like, because I often thought about this. It's like if I looked at, both my parents were addicts and alcoholics and stuff, and so there was like a lot of that, a lot of yelling and violence and all that kind of stuff, right? And I've thought about that, if you just added up all the incidences of trauma, right, and you just condensed it into a period of time, I bet it actually isn't that much time. But the events themselves, right, weren't the thing that was traumatizing. I think the thing that was traumatizing was having a horizon, right, open to a possibility called you could be humiliated at any second, right? It's those that something is your life or your identity or your it was possible at some moment, like the world could just turn upside down. That anticipation of that possibility becomes the orientation. So you go from a sense of you really can't listen, right? You can only hear what you're listening for. And if you're in danger, right, the world will show up in terms of that. And that's what's so interesting about, and so, in working through trauma myself, and like, being a part of other people working through it and all that kind of stuff, it's like, it's so interesting because the traumatic response, right, is an attempt to resolve the trauma. However, the trauma requires the world to be indexed in terms of it so that I can overcome it. So that's how I think people end up getting into like repeated patterns of re-traumatization, if you will, right? Like, somebody's like has 20 jobs, but they're in the same conflict in every job. They have the same boss somehow, right? Like they get in the same relationship, these kinds of things. And it's so interesting because that's what makes it really tricky. Like is there's this period where you have to start to hear, right, that you're not hearing, right? You really have to start, like, it just seems like that seems to be, and that's a very philosophical, right? And I don't hear this talked about that much, but that's a very philosophical thing to do, right? And it's very difficult too, which is to begin to hear, right, that I'm not hearing, that I'm actually not listening. I'm already presupposing the world in a certain term. And then on some level, in my anticipation, it draws up to me as a thing to fight, a thing to flee, a thing to freeze at, or something like that, right? And so it seems that in some sense, it's a little bit like waking up in lucid dreaming, right? Where it's a very deep cognitive disclosure to be able to hear that I'm not listening, But the moment that you hear that you're not listening, just like when you're in a dream and it dawns on you that you're dreaming, is the moment, right, that everything shifts. Everything is kind of predicated on that. So I really appreciate what you're saying about trauma. I think it's a very deep thing. Because I think what a lot of what we're talking about, I propose, is like the difference between curiosity and wonder, right? Curiosity, in the technical sense of the word, is has to do with problem solving, right? It's like you go down this train in order to find it, like solve a problem, right? There's a way in which curiosity can be, as John talks about it, if you increase curiosity, it's not pleasant, right? If you increase wonder, it becomes more and more and more pleasant, right? Or something that's nourishing. And I think that essentially one of the things that is a sign of our deepest nihilism, right, really has to do with our absence of wonder, right? And our that on so in a big way, and I really kind of I think I really take this from Heidegger of it's becoming more and more difficult to be able to see a world such that the response to that world would be wonderment, right? Yet it's in this sense of, that I think the video that you were talking about, where I was talking about with Heraclitus, this is what I'm really getting. I had no idea I was going to be this paper that I'm writing, right, about essentially dialogos, right? I had no idea that it'd be so based on Heraclitus. I had no idea that was going to happen, but I started reading Heraclitus and I'm like, whoa, this is precisely the logos, and that we don't hear the logos is precisely the very, you could say the basis upon which not to proclaim nihilism, the necessary, if you will, nihilism that comes from not listening to the logos, right? It's and so the more I started to look into it, the more I started to it's really started to occur to me that this is why dialogos, looking through logos, right, is so directly on the mark in terms of addressing nihilism, right? Because it is that sense, wonder happens when you have that sense where you're looking at some pattern, right? Or you're looking, like, say, at artwork, and all of a sudden you start to see the deeper pattern, right? Or you can go, oh, this is this kind of painting. This is this from this time. This is a Rembrandt, or it starts to disclose itself to you, right? Part of that disclosure, right, that I think is so evokes the mood of wonder is that what's disclosed, right, doesn't appear, right? It precisely appears in that it doesn't appear. Its flagrancy, right, is the result of our participating with something so deeply that it starts to shine through and reveals the harmony or the wholeness of the world through all of its parts. But it precisely, this is why I think hearing is the metaphor here, or listening is the metaphor. It's because you don't necessarily see it with your senses, right? It's not immediately given, but you definitely perceive it. In fact, it's like the kind of thing that when you perceive it, it discloses the world as a song, right? Versus just the notes that don't make any sense, and you start to hear the song. That is, you can only do that with your whole being, you can't have that experience, those kinds of experiences without it being transformative of yourself. That's where learning and the transformation of the self are almost exactly the same thing. Well, on some level, I've been kind of realizing it's one of those. And of course, here's the fractal, right? I'm like, oh, this is why I've been interested in all this stuff. It's like, oh, the sense of the logos of being able to gather yourself, right? With gathering as such, in such a way that psyche, in the Greek sense, is your kind of your constitutional openness to the logos, right? Like as you start to comport yourself, like what you're talking about, comport yourself to the world such that you're listening into what isn't apparent, right? But beckons to you in a cultivated sense of intelligibility. And as you do that, and you have more of those experiences, it starts to invite more of the experience everywhere, which is what I think you're saying. It's like reading Heidegger. It's not just about reading. It's not just about reading books, right? You read a couple of pages of Heidegger, and you walk out, and you walk in your neighborhood. It's a different neighborhood, right? It deeply affects the way that you participate in the world in a co-reflective, opening way. But as Heraclitus says, it is possible just to listen to me and not the logos, right? And I think that's the difference between hearing and listening, right? There is a way where,
yeah,
right, I can live within the measurement of the logos, its measure, right, its forms, its in some sense its intelligibility, right, and I can participate in it, I can carry it on, but without actually listening to the source of it. And it's that listening to the source of it, which I think is innately human. It is what it is to be human, right? Is that we are the beings, right? That can, in some sense, we can hear the song of the universe, right? It becomes hearable in our constitution, right? Now that very openness is also the same openness that made it possible to not hear it, right? And that's what's interesting, is like the very freedom, right, that constitutes and makes us able to hear the being of beings, to hear the wholeness of the universe in the particular situations of suchness, right? That same openness is also the moment freedom becomes possible, is the moment that prison could become possible, right? And we can forget about it. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, even in the course of listening to you speaking, I can move between being a space for the emergence of Guy and then dropping back a layer and being like, well, how's the interview going? Or like, what's, I can become like much more aware of my immediate spatial environment. And this is partly to do with Zoom. And it was something interesting which came up with my girlfriend, was that she's
part of the fruits of this. When you were there was a certain moment where you talked about like, yeah, and some of the fruits of this, and you smiled. I was like, I bet if I asked about that, I bet he's talking one of the fruits is this relationship that you're in now, right?
Yes. Yeah. To a large extent. She watched the podcast and pulled me through the internet into a shared reality. So
Congratulations, my friend. I'm really happy to hear about
Yeah.
this.
Thank you, Guy. It's very, very exciting.
Yeah, I bet. Enlivening.
A lot of things, a lot of dancing.
Yeah.
But one of the things that she noticed was um, there was a different way of me seeing her when we were speaking. Um, and there was a way in which I could be seeing, and it was like she is emerging and appearing. And then there's a way in which my vision would almost go through her and backwards into me. And so that's the what was the distinction you said just now? It was like the listening and the
Hearing and listening.
hearing and listening. Yeah. So I can be hearing you and seeing you, but I'm somehow elastically in the past, and then the past is present through what I'm seeing, in the same way that the dream that you have, the disturbing dream that you have, can kind of come through into your conscious day, and manifest and shape the reality that you experience. And so you were saying earlier, there's something that I'm still unpacking, and it's something to do with the relationship between the trauma and the body and time, and this sense in which I can be not fully present to the present to the logos of what's actually going on, in the sense that there's the way that you talked about these events. I mean, there's different kinds. You can have a sort of singular event which has an explosive quality to it, and I think that this actually has a force, pay toll, which affects the fabric of space-time as we experience it as embodied beings. So it's like you're going back along the kind of roots of your being into the past, and these events it's a little bit like if you ever have seen an explosion take place underwater or inside of a ballistics gel. It's like it's contained within the thing, but there's a real energy stored in those events. And then you can also have more kind of, like you were saying, like anticipatory or anxiety can be a trauma as well, in the sense that you're anticipating something happening so much that it sinks deeply into your being. But this is somehow key to understanding our temporality, that we can be not fully present, in that our bodies are like containers of all of the past.
It's so interesting too. It's like, I mean, like one of the clearest examples of that for me was and it's resulted in my marriage, right? Really, was for the first 3-4 years, I would have this experience that was so obvious to me that my girlfriend at the time, my wife now, was attacking me. And of course, I'm not going to tolerate being attacked, right? No one should tolerate being attacked. So it's just obvious. I'm not going to tolerate it. And then I would hear her say things like, "No, it's like you turned it into that. Like if you would just, she's saying I'm not attacking you. I'm basically saying I'm in pain or something like that, right? Whatever it was." And there was a moment where there were like a number of moments where I got a sense, a whiff of that I could actually be in a hallucination, right? That in precisely the degree in which it occurred as absolutely real was almost the thing that made it so, was able to let me be suspicious of it. And also starting to see that, like, if what's at stake, right? Because I loved her more than I've loved anybody, right? And when there was that sense in which, what if it was like something like, what if I leave this relationship, the person I've loved more than anyone else in my whole life, and what I actually left was my own projection, right? Like, so something about there's a leverage there that started to kind of come in. And there was this leap where I actually kind of had to just take it on faith on some level, of that I'm actually not experiencing what my whole being is telling me that I'm experiencing. And it was so interesting because there'd be a moment where, and I would just be like, all right, I'm going to just respond as if I'm not being attacked, right? And in that, I noticed the first thing I'm confronted with is that I'm frozen. And I had no idea how frozen I was, right? And then I start to move towards her in a loving way or in this way. And instantly, it completely went in another direction. It like went to more intimacy and in very quickly. Like, and I remember experiencing that. I'm like, oh, whoa, how the hell did that happen? And it was true. It's like there was a part of my being that, and it because I grew up in an environment, right, that I couldn't hear the horizons that I was kind of, you could say, for having, right? That had her show up in those situations, show up to me in that way. It was just reality. And that little spark of doubt, that little sense of being open to hearing something different, right? And then responding to with that difference in such a way, like instantly, everything, it like the whole thing shifted. And then, I would have these experiences where we'd get into another interaction and I'd remember that last experience, right? And I'm like, but I couldn't find it. I couldn't find the button that it would have me respond as if I'm not being attacked, right? And I would think to myself, am I crazy right now? Or was I crazy then? Right. And then at some point I just started to, it was like a perceptual shift where I just started caring about assuming that what she was saying is that, one, she loved me, right? And two, something was hurting. And then so just respond to it, right? Unfreeze and respond. And then I would. And then the whole thing would open up. And it was so interesting because it was this whole period where it felt like I was coming out of a mirage of some kind, right? A hallucination of some kind. And then it was less about really knowing what to do. It was more like a place to sit, right? And then I just found myself sitting or relaxing back into myself. And it was just there. That perception, that openness was just there. And then it's like, now we're married. We haven't had a fight like that in like 3.5 years. It's really interesting.
Love is powerful stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
At the level of that moment, one of the real complexities that comes out of this is gaslighting. And I had experiences of this working through is like, you are in that elastic back into the past thing. So you drop into a very heightened state of vigilance or sensitivity to the people around you. And then they are just being their normal, slightly dysfunctional selves or whatever. And then you face a choice as to whether you presence and articulate it or not. Because a lot of people, they choose to just like keep it in and not presence it, and that is almost guaranteed to prevent its resolution. But if you do presence it and it's absurd or something in the context of where you're at, the other people might choose to just deny that it's happening, and improperly related to, they can unintentionally gaslight you by saying what you're experiencing isn't real. And this actually leads down an even more, a worse path, which is trauma combined with a lack of trust in the reality that you share with other people. And conversely, it's that love and trust that you're describing, which affords the right presencing of the thing. So you can be feeling it, and then you can make the affirmative step to presence what it is. And if the person loves you and there's an adequate degree of trust developing between the two of you, then you can just allow it to be there. And then you can sort of begin to work within and around it and start to sort of disclose the wider reality that is present and not contained within this. And then suddenly you get that quite radical shift. And it's like, I was in a bad trip and I've broken out of it, and now I'm in a different, palpably different experience of reality. And this is so ontologically deep. It's so deep to the level of my experience of being that it's like, it's not just that what was immediately salient in my landscape was thoroughly diminished. And it's not just the sense of the depression, of the pulling down, of the something you can't quite get away from. It's also that the future seems to narrow as well. And the past perhaps enlarge or is more important. And so
that's a telltale sign I've come to recognize is and I think this is just the case with emotions, right? Like usually the more intense the emotional experience, if you notice, the feeling of forever and always comes with it, right? Like when you're really depressed, right? There's that experience of not only am I depressed, and not only is it totally fucked, but it's always been fucked, and it's always going to be fucked, and it's obvious. And then if I try to conjure up a memory inside of that depression, that memory, right, of some time when I wasn't depressed, just occurs as, oh, I was obviously just full of shit. I was delusional, right? There's something about the totality, and I think it's what Heidegger really talks about with mood. Mood, right, we have these kind of ontological moods, right, that attune us and reveal to us how things seem, right? And they really are reality enforcing in some way. And I think when I think about this is like, you're right, this is where relationship, right, and things like safety and friendship and in cultivating that, this is how we become who we are, is through our contact with other people, right? I mean, on some level, I feel like I am constituted by all of the conversations in my life, right? In such a profound way, right? And so for me, the key thing is really trusting that my wife actually loved me. And the thing that I would lose, and it makes sense because when I was a kid, the world would just turn. Like it would just suddenly turn. And all of a sudden I was in hell and everything was in danger, right? And it was this experience of the people in my life that were caring for me, all of a sudden were like, not like, not only not caring for me, but right, hurting me. And that one, malevolence, right? When people experience malevolence from other people, right? That one, whew, that one is tough to recover from. So there was this kind of sovereignty that I had to muster up in that of, I really had to choose to be willing to see that she loved me, right? And it was in that kind of faith, right, and stepping into that, right, that the moment that I did and I responded to her and not that complex, right, it was so instant. It was the moment everything went, we just dropped in. And I also realized, like, oh my God, like I can actually, there's a way in which when I get triggered, right, like, and I get this sense that you don't love me or you don't really care about me, right? The whole world changes. But conversely, when I can kind of come into contact and actually feel into, no, you at the deepest level, you love me, right? And attune to that was in this instance, and what I'm talking about was the difference that made all the difference for me. And this is why one of the things that I feel, one of the things that drives me to continue to cultivate circling as a practice is that I think on some level circling is the practice of that sense of philia, right? That sense of a deep kinship and friendship, right? And being gathered together and cultivating that is why I think is the very basis of Philia Sophia philosophy, right? That they really kind of go hand in hand. Is this cultivating friendship and kinship and community and developing ways to let people know that you actually do care about them, right? And you're cared for, and having your heart be open to people and having that sense of safety and bring in making it like, I think the thing I think is really important is I and what circling I believe does is it does do this. It takes that out of the back office in the psychotherapist room and starts to bring it actually with the possibility of a social practice that we can actually be attuned to, right? Because I think it's that safety and that kinship that affords us to be able to open up to the veil, what's beyond the veil, right? Those horizons of intelligibility is through friendship.
Mm. And your therapist doesn't love you by necessity of what that occupation and what that field and what the understandings of that whole system of a way of relating to the person.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right.
It's not about
Right.
that. It's a professional, it's constrained, and it doesn't have mutuality and all those things.
Yeah.
I've never actually tried therapy, but I've heard so many god
Yeah.
awful experiences from so many people that I have to wonder what's going wrong. But
Right.
there's something. So there's something in the experience of trauma and trauma resolution, which tends to bring out shamanic kinds of capacities in people, which seems to be a seeing through the surfaces of other people,
Yeah.
At an embodied level,
Right.
Which is connected with the love in some way. And with the other piece that I want to presence is that when you've established that trusting, loving relationship with your wife or with somebody in your circle, some intimate relationship, and you drop back in your body to the time period in which the trauma occurred and re-presence it in the present. My sense is that the love as a kind of multidimensional ontological force is somehow going backwards in time to that moment.
Yeah.
Like it's
Yeah.
like the release of the energy, the energetic payload of the traumatic experiences is concurrently the sending backwards of the love to the event.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so when you are having these encounters with people, and I'm sure you've had something similar, somebody presences something from the past completely raw and with all of the emotional payload with it, and you're able to give love to it in the present moment.
Mm-hmm.
We're actually sending love backwards in time, because the body is existing trans-temporally.
Right.
The present we experience is constituted psychedelically of the set and setting of all of the past experiences, the associations and the dreams, and and so the work is occurring trans-temporally.
Yeah.
And this can also happen collectively with, like, sort of, there are people who go on reconciliation missions of like going and seeking forgiveness from some people that their ancestors had wronged, and there are these big emotional events of the long held emotional traumas, even of many centuries held.
Yeah, totally. And I'm really liking this, how you're this bringing this sense of temporality into it, because it does really have it does have a healing power, right? In very much the same way, we were talking about this, I think, before we started recording, about when someone has an insight, right? I kind of notice, like, when somebody has an insight, there's this thing that they do with their eyes. First, it's like this, and then at some point they start to do this with I've asked, every time I've asked, what are you doing there? They're actually picturing their past, right? And usually, because an insight is revelatory of the frame, right? It's not like it necessarily like a discovery out in front of you. It's more like an insight to what was concealed in its nearness, but constituting, right? And so when you have one of those frame, psycho-emotional frame seeing, then just like in Bruce Willis's movie The Sixth Sense, right, where he's dead the whole time and no one knows it, then he recognizes right at the end, and he goes all the way back to the first scene of the movie, and scene by scene, you see the whole time that you've been watching that he was dead, and it was obvious, just unconcealed. And like, and that's a great example of how identity shifting that can be. And I really kind of feel that there's something about there's something about a ground of philiac love, right? Of really being in it with somebody. Like, and because it's interesting, 'cause that's definitely my experience. I have clients and stuff, and I've had clients that I've had for years, and like, so there's a professional relationship. But my experience is that when we're together, I become friends with all of them. Like I fall in love with my clients, right? It's like, it's not, in fact, I find that you could say it's effective to the degree that I'm really in it with them and having the insights with them, and like, in being deeply affected and changed in the interaction and sharing that as well, right? Um, what that seems to create is seems to be the soil that allows us to open up to positive traumas, right? Because if you think about it, like, the difference between trauma and like a spiritual experience is structurally very similar, right? It's like, you have a recognition of the unity that's been like, that you've been disconnected from your whole life, and it questions all of your assumptions about who you were and what it was, and all of a sudden you're now spiritually traumatized in a way that you wish you always were. That there's an openness to I think it almost does the reverse, right? In the sense,
connection to connection.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Where you start to have the kind of listening that you're talking about, that you walk around in the world with, right? Where it's like there's a certain level where you find yourself listening for what you don't know, right? Like, I would imagine it's just because you've been like ontologically positively traumatizing yourself now for last, that there's in whereas trauma is something like my forehaving is, I'm already gathering the world in terms of it and then responding to it. I think with, these kind of deep ontological disclosures, it almost does the same thing in reverse, where it's like, I actually surrender my forehavings and I listen for something I can't know before, and attune to that and be attuned by that. They're very similar, right? The machinery is very similar.
Yeah, I feel that. Yeah, we're gonna have to expand on that one in a future conversation, Guy.
I look forward to it. This has really been fun. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I felt what I was enjoying about it was that sense in which we're both, like, I think that conversation in some sense exemplified the content that we were talking about. Like, you could tell at certain moments where you're talking, where it was like, I could feel you and myself just at the edge of what I understood, and it kind of coming into articulation, right? And time disappeared, and Dialogos.
I think we're breaking new ground with this, and there's no one I'd rather be presencing these insights into trauma with. So I think we're actually, there is something emerging out of these conversations, and we're getting at something quite metaphysical and juicy and profound. So look forward to continuing it, really. Great to have you on, Guy.
Enjoying our friendship, my friend.
Likewise.